Okay, just to give a sort of a overview of what the next week or so is going to look like. Today, we're covering costs and supply. This is going to be probably the most mathematically intensive day. So if you are not a math person, I do apologize. But on the other hand, once you get past this part, you know, it doesn't get much harder from there, right? Like it's really just this. And it's also not that hard. Like we're talking like algebra 1 still here. The real question here is not how difficult the math is. It's just understanding the model well enough to know which pieces of the real world go where in the model, right? That's the real difficult part. It's not so much like I'm going to have you do a lot of like derivatives and exponents and whatever, right? The actual math is easy. It's just, you know, connecting that math to the context. So there's that. All right. So we've been talking a lot about the demand curve, right? A lot of the sort of marginal benefit, marginal cost, efficient stuff that we've been talking about applies to both the supply and supply and demand sides of the market. But we've sort of been focusing a lot on demand side examples, largely because it's just easier to think about, right? It's easier to think about because we are a lot more experienced generally with buying stuff than we are with selling stuff, most of us, right? But also because there's a lot more that we can do on the supply side in terms of thinking about what's going on underneath the hood of those decisions. And so we're going to be focusing on that today. So we're going to be going under the hood of the supply curve. We're going to be asking what is it? Well, first of all, we know what the supply curve measures, right? The supply curve tells us how many units are going to be supplied given the price. We give you a price. What is the quantity supplied at that price? That's just what the supply curve is. In order to figure out what that is, right, for a given price, how many units do people want to sell? We have to ask ourselves, well, what is going to do that? Why are they doing that, right? We know they're trying to set marginal benefit equal to marginal cost, but we know that we can say a little bit more than that. So we need to ask, what's going to encourage a producer to supply a unit? Why are they looking for a particular price when they're deciding whether or not to sell something? What's going on there? So a supplier is going to produce a unit of the good if, following the cost benefit principle, the benefits exceed the costs. This is what we've been saying the whole time, right? This is not new. So when you think about what are the benefits for the cost, we know they want to set marginal benefit equal to marginal cost. The benefits are super easy, right? If we're talking about competitive market where they have no control over the price whatsoever, all they can do is make stuff and sell it for the price. Every time you sell a unit of the good, you get paid the price, right? Every time somebody sells me a jalapeno, they make 20 cents. Every time they sell me an apple, they make $3, whatever the price is, right? So that we're going to sort of keep fixed right now, right? So from a producer's point of view, if they have no control over the price, right, the price just sort of falls from the heavens into their hands and they are responding to it. Right? That's sort of the role we're going to stay in for right now. We'll relax that a little bit later. But we're going to say that the price just sort of comes from somewhere else that we have no control over. Right? And we know where it comes from. It comes from supply and demand, right? If we have a market supply and demand, we have an equilibrium price, right? And so if we are a producer and we're saying, hey, look at what I can sell my stuff for these days, where did that come from? Well, we know the answer to that. It came from the supply and demand curve. But given that, if we want to take this whole market and just think about it from the perspective of one supplier, what are they doing, right? What's the actual choice that's going into their decision making? And it's going to be based on the cost, right? We know that the marginal cost is sort of baked into the supply curve. I give you a quantity. You can follow it up to the supply curve, and that's going to be whatever the marginal cost is at that particular number of units. Okay. You all know that. So we're going to be focusing on those costs. Where do they come from? How can we think about them in more detail? How do individual producers make their choices, and how can we build back up to this supply curve that we have here? Okay, so we're going to break down the idea of costs a little bit more. Okay, we're going to separate out different types of costs, so we can think about where those different costs are coming from and how they're going to contribute to the supply curve. We're going to get a better idea of what's going on, what firms are actually trying to do, how they are trying to maximize their profits by setting marginal benefit equal to marginal cost. So let's start out by just separating out our costs a little bit. So we're going to start with the idea of total costs. And I showed you total costs a little bit before, right? Because we remember that concept check where I said, hey, your total costs of production were 10Q. You had to figure out that the marginal costs were different than that. Well, total costs are coming back. So we're going to start with the idea of total cost. This is the entirety of all the costs that you have to expend, both direct and indirect, to produce whatever it is you're going to produce, right? All the costs you pay in order to produce some number of items, some number of units, which includes the opportunity cost. And it is contingent on how much you are producing, right? If you're a shirt manufacturer who makes 1 million shirts a year, your costs are probably going to be higher than somebody who makes 3 because you are making more shirts, right? The more stuff you're making, the more costs you're going to have. So we're going to start by breaking down total costs into 2 different areas. We have fixed costs and variable costs. Right? So we got 2 different kinds of costs that we're splitting things up into, and we're going to think about what these 2 different kinds of things are and how they're all going to factor into decision making. So we have total cost equals fixed cost equals variable cost, or TC equals FC plus VC. Let's figure out what those 2 things actually are. Let's start with fixed costs. Fixed costs are costs that you pay no matter how many units you make. Right? So as long as you are open for business, you are paying these costs. You can't get them back. It would take you some time to stop paying these things. Right? You can't just stop on a dime. You cannot change your fixed costs in the short run. That is what makes them fixed. So remember, I've mentioned a couple of times, right, when I've been talking about returns to scale and things like that, how we're sort of in the short run where you can't change, you don't have time to change your machine, you don't have time to scale up super, super big, right? Same idea here, right? We have some sort of fixed costs that, maybe if we wanted to upscale our business or downscale our business, we could change those things in the long run, but for now we're sort of stuck with it, right? Imagine you're running a yogurt shop, right? And you have a little space in downtown Seattle where you run your yogurt shop. And it's like, man, business is really, really good. I want to expand. Well, if you want to expand to a second location, it's going to take you some time, right? Or if business is really bad and you want to shut down, that's also going to take you some time because you still got to pay your lease and you're on the hook for all that. And, you got to pay severance, you want to fire people. So, these fixed costs, right? The cost of your rent there at that one location that you have is fixed. You can't change that immediately. If you want to shut down, you're still going to be stuck paying that for a little while. If you want to expand, it's going to be a while before you can expand to a second location, right? It just takes time to do these things. In the short run, our costs are fixed, and it does not matter how much we are producing. We have to pay that rent on our space for the yogurt shop, whether we're selling 1 cup of yogurt a day or 1 million cups of yogurt a day, right? Whenever it is, we're still paying the rent, and so that is a fixed cost. It's not sensitive to how much we are producing. This can be rent on your location or your space. It could be paying the server for your website. Anything like that. Also opportunity costs, right? The opportunity cost of being in some other business will typically be a fixed cost as well. If we think, hey, nobody wants yogurt anymore, it's cold and rainy, I should probably switch to making soup. Well, again, you could at any given point be making soup instead of yogurt. The fact that you're not making soup is an opportunity cost, right? You're giving up the opportunity to profit from the soup industry. And so one of the fixed costs of being in yogurt is that you are not making soup. Okay? And that continues to be the case no matter whether you're making 1 million cups of yogurt a day or just 1. So anything we cannot change in the short run, that is going to be our fixed costs. On the other hand, variable costs, straightforward. They're costs that do depend on how much stuff you make. Right? The more stuff you make, the more you are paying in these variable costs. So let's say you're running a bakery or something like that. The more baked goods that you are making and selling, the more flour you have to buy, the more sugar, the more chocolate, and so on. You got to pay people more hours of work, all that sort of stuff. This also could include some opportunity costs, right? If you are choosing to spend your time making chocolate donuts, as opposed to making a bunch of maple donuts, then you're, by making the chocolate donuts, one of the costs of doing so is making fewer maple donuts. So we got 2 different kinds of costs, right? We got fixed costs, which are not sensitive to how much you are producing, right? They're just, you can sort of think of them as startup costs, although it's not really the same thing. The startup costs generally would go into fixed costs as well. And we have variable costs that do care about the amount of stuff you're making. Now let's say that we have an equation that represents our costs. So here's our total cost equation, right? We plug in a quantity, it will tell us what our costs are to produce that much quantity. So I want to know the cost of making 1 million cups of yogurt. I plug in 1 million for quantity, and it would tell me how much it's going to cost me to make that much yogurt. Okay. Now in this, we can set. Now it's pretty easy to spot where the fixed costs and variable costs are, because one part of this does not have a Q in it, right? If it doesn't have a Q in it, then it can't possibly be changing with the quantity. So this right here, that's going to be our fixed cost. The 90 is our fixed cost. No matter how much we're making, we still have that fixed cost of 90. It does not change. Another good way to find the fixed cost, by the way, is if you put in a quantity of 0. Put in a quantity of 0 and see what your costs are. You say, hey, if I wasn't making anything, what costs would I still have to pay? Those are going to be your fixed costs, right? You don't make any yogurt, you're still paying the rent, you're still paying the bills, right? You're still paying for insurance, all that sort of stuff. Those are all fixed costs. 2Q, on the other hand, that is the variable cost, right? Because it has a Q in it. The higher your quantity goes, the bigger this 2Q is going to be. So that's going to be our variable cost right there. Another way to think about variable cost is if you take the total cost and you just subtract out the fixed cost, which we found by setting quantity to 0. One way you can do it. We can also from this find the marginal cost, right? We know what marginal cost is. Marginal cost is the additional cost we get and by every time we make one more unit. And here it's going to be 2, right? Every time we increase quantity by 1, our costs go up by 2. Right, so our marginal cost here is 2. Notice, by the way, that the marginal cost only comes from the variable cost part of the equation. That's always going to be true. Because if you think about it, marginal cost is all about how much additional cost you get when your quantity goes up. The fixed cost doesn't change when your quantity goes up. So it can't possibly have your marginal costs in it.